Perfect. All right, well, thank you. That was a very exciting announcement. And now we're going to move on to our next panel. So I'll invite the panelists to come up here on stage with me as I introduce the topic. So if you or your kids have ever had a gaming account reset or lost any digital items, you know that it can feel just as real as losing a physical item. Or if that feeling doesn't resonate with you, perhaps you're old enough to remember recording over something important on VHS and not being able to recover it. Direct ownership of digital assets does not necessarily prevent their loss, but the ability to own assets can change the relationship between individuals and corporations in online environments. This panel will examine the risks and benefits of moving to such a system and if consumers want to own their own assets, for example, in gaming accounts and social media and beyond. It is my pleasure. Do we have everybody up here? Eliana, you want to come up? And I see Sart is up here. Zach? There you are. Okay. You need to come around the stairs. Yes. Okay, we can get a little closer here for our panel. And Elliot, you can just come up around the stairs. I think then you'll be able to get on stage. Okay, so I'll start introducing. So it's my pleasure to welcome panelists Zach Lewis, Sarterus Rowe, and Eliana Torres. Zach Lewis is an associate in the Interactive Entertainment and Blockchain Technology groups at Franklin, Kurnit, Klein, and Selz PC. He helps clients across a wide range of industries, from video games and music to fashion, food, film, to navigate the developing legal landscape surrounding the metaverse, non-fungible tokens, and Web3. Sarterus Rowe is the Director of Technology and Innovation at the Eastside Legal Assistance Program. Sart was the Executive Director of Inclusive Law, a nonprofit focused on helping diverse families and social organizations. He also teaches as an adjunct professor in the areas of privacy law, ethics, copyright, and information policy. And Eliana Torres is an associate in the intellectual property group at Nixon Peabody LLP, where she leverages her experience as an attorney at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to provide comprehensive advice on complex trademark issues, such as those involving NFTs, cryptocurrency, and blockchain technologies. And last but not least, I will be your moderator for this session. I'm a US-based attorney, the blockchain and Web3 advisor for XRSI, an advisor for the Kinkellis Group, in addition to running a private law practice. And I'm involved in many areas of emerging technology, including artificial intelligence and blockchain implications on intellectual property rights, and assisting with digital asset policies in the US and internationally. Let's see, are we all sort of situated here on stage? Maybe we can stand here so I can get a good view of everybody. All right. So welcome everyone to this panel. The name of the panel is The Promised Land, Risks and Opportunities with Asset Ownership in Digital Economies. And since we're all lawyers on the stage, I'll give the general disclaimer that none of this is legal advice. However, we do hope to bring our diverse experiences in the field to this panel to offer a practical perspective on the issues. So if we can, by a show of hands, or of emoji hands, how many of you own digital assets? This could be sword, a skin in a game, a special hair in Roblox, NFT, cryptocurrency, anything like that. A good share of the audience, as we are here in avatar form, own digital assets, maybe not that big of a surprise. So great. So before we get started, we wanted to take a moment to define a couple of kind of key terms here and what we mean by digital assets. So simply put, digital assets are any type of digital file or data that exists in a digital format. So this could include things like documents, images, audio files, videos, even software. But in the blockchain space, and as the term is being commonly used today, a digital asset has come to mean something like cryptocurrencies or NFTs or things that are verified and tracked on a blockchain. So key advantages of using blockchain digital assets are security and transparency. And this is because ideally blockchains are decentralized and distributed, and they are resistant to tampering and corruption. And that makes them more secure and a reliable way to store and manage digital assets. So the ownership and transfer of such assets can be tracked, providing a level of transparency and accountability that's not really possible with other types of and other methods of asset management. So in today's panel, we'll be discussing the various types of digital assets, the ways in which they're used, and the challenges and opportunities that they present. Our panelists are experts in the field, and I'm excited to hear their insights. Thank you for joining us. Please welcome the panel by emoji clap. So after that kind of brief introduction to digital assets, I wanted to throw it to Zach to give a little bit of an overview of kind of the progression from Web 1 to Web 2 to Web 3 and NFTs and some of the underlying ownership issues that are related there.
Thank you, Liz. I apologize if my voice sounds terrible. I just got diagnosed with COVID, but luckily everyone here is safe in the metaverse with us. So what is Web3? I know that it was discussed a little bit on the last panel, but it's important to understand that the future of digital economies is highly intertwined with the future of the internet, and the future of the internet is referred to as Web3. I think it makes most sense to explain Web3 in the context of what Web 1 and Web 2 is. So in the first iteration of the internet, or Web 1, it was the read-only web. So you could go onto websites and you could read, static content. Essentially, websites were just information boards. In Web 2, which is the internet of today, users can read and write their content. So they can upload content to platforms like YouTube or Facebook. But in order to do so, first, you have to create an account specific with that platform. And second, you have to agree to terms, usually saying that the platform is going to own all of the content that you upload to it. So Web3 is really revolutionary because it's the next iteration of the internet where you can read, write, and own the content that you upload to these platforms without having any permission from any third party. And the way that's effectuated, or the way that that's done, is through connecting your digital wallets, which are compatible with several different platforms, and ownership of your content, as uploaded to these platforms, will be proven by linking that property to NFTs. I know a few people raised their hands when we talked about owning digital assets, but just by a show of emojis, who here is familiar with how blockchain technology works and what an NFT actually is? Because it's not just the JPEG, and I know that a lot of people love their digital art. Okay, so a few people do seem to understand or have some familiarity with blockchain, but for everyone else, allow me to just explain a little bit. So most people know that NFTs are based on blockchain technology, but the concept is foreign to them. So simply put, a blockchain is just a database where blocks of data are chained together, like Liz said, to create a single source of truth or transparency for the public. And the reason why, as Liz mentioned, these databases are more secure than other databases is because every block in a blockchain has its own cryptographic hash or fingerprint, which contains the fingerprint of the block that came before it. So you can this creates like a sequentially organized and unbroken chain that's traceable to the very first block. So you can track exactly how and when digital assets moved and who they were, sold from, et cetera, sold to. Blockchains are distributed and decentralized ledgers, so the data is replicated and stored across various electronic devices called nodes, rather than being stored in a single central server or database. And every node verifies each block before it's added to the chain. So blocks are only added when a certain number of nodes reach a consensus on the transaction, and these characteristics are what make blockchains immutable, meaning it's virtually impossible for someone to manipulate past data, because that would result in changing the hash, creating a new chain that the nodes would not be able to validate through a consensus. And this is why, as Liz mentioned, blockchains are a lot more secure than centralized databases. So what are NFTs? NFTs are really just entries of data on a blockchain. NFT stands for non-fungible token. And you can think of, in contrast to cryptocurrency, which is fungible because every Bitcoin is the same as every other Bitcoin, each NFT is unique because it has its own name, ID number, and set of metadata or descriptive information that distinguishes it from every other token. So in the metadata, there's something called a URI, a Uniform Resource Identifier, that points to the digital asset that Liz mentioned, or even the real world asset that users can see what the token represents. So of course, NFTs can be bought and sold on secondary markets like OpenSea, and issuers can offer their collectors special benefits. But it's really just important to understand that Web3, blockchain, and NFTs are distinct concepts that are all independently vital to the future of digital economies.
Thank you so much for that overview, Zach. And I wanted to ask Eliana to give us a brief introduction to IP in this space and just kind of an overview to give us some groundwork for where we're going to talk, what we're going to talk about today. There. I saw that she went off the stage. While we're waiting for Eliana to be back, why don't we go on to the first question and then we can come back to the introduction for the IP when maybe the technical difficulties are solved here. So I wanted to start the discussion today by talking about some decisions that major corporations have made, including Mojang, who owns Minecraft, to exclude NFTs from their platforms by maintaining control and ownership over those assets on their platforms. So overall, basically all digital assets on their platform. So is this a move to protect intellectual property? Is it revenue protection? Is it for the safety of their users and players, as they have suggested? Or is there something else at play here? Sart, do you want to take that question first?
Definitely. I think it's a controlled decision for their platform and keeping things internal. Their reputation and how others could monopolize pieces of it really is part of that. When you start to segregate ownership out and allow third parties to control pieces of it, you can eventually lose control over those parts of the market. I'm not surprised given their value and size. I think that allowing the third-party ownership on particular platforms is a way to encourage a new user base to have a stake in what you're building. But when you have something that is as large and successful, it comes with a certain amount of risk to it also.
That makes sense. Zach, any thoughts on that?
I do think a lot of it is about IP protection. And I also think that in terms of just Minecraft specifically, I think that people in the video game industry or gamers in particular are very hostile towards NFTs right now because they view them more, they perceive them as tools for extraction of value rather than the provision of value, which I think we have like a lot of education to do so people can start to understand why it might be beneficial for them to actually own their digital assets in game. But I think that it really is just a matter, besides the fact that, the creators of Minecraft know that their fan base, their users aren't, foaming at the mouth over owning NFTs. I think that another element at play here is that the regulation surrounding NFTs is so it's developing in real time and developing quite slowly. And there are so many different areas of the law that have to be considered here. Even just the fact of, export sanctions controls and money transmission and anti-money laundering and knowing your customer, because once you upload something, once you mint an NFT onto a blockchain as a digital asset, you don't get to control who purchases it and where they're from, et cetera. So I think that a lot of this is just waiting for some of the dust to settle and just waiting for more clarity on what a compliant NFT program actually looks like in that industry.
Yeah, I think those are really, really good points because when these announcements came out, it was clear that there was just a lot of, I guess, animosity, towards NFTs, and that the term itself kind of became a dirty word. And there are so many reasons legally why companies might want to be more precautionary in their approach here and moving forward and not jump into the space. But I think it's so important to separate the technology from some of the things that were some of the perceptions that people have about the NFT space. And so I hope we can get to a point where companies and individuals can look at these technologies and see their potential beyond, any thoughts that they've developed and are harboring now. I want to turn back to Ellie for a minute, if we can, to do a quick overview of some of the IP issues in this area. Ellie, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here finally. Sorry, my audio was kind of not working for some reason. I'm sure it was me. pressing I was playing around with all the features. But yeah, just happy to be here. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. I'll start with the majority of the issues that we see right now in this space are surrounding trademarks and copyrights. We don't see as much patent issues yet, but the majority of the conversation leans towards what the trademarks and the copyrights that implicate especially when it comes to NFTs and the rights that creators are granting the buyers, and back and forth what you'll be allowed to do with those rights after the fact. So that's a brief kind of one-on-one of like what's going on, and I could go into more of a basic of like what is a trademark, what is a copyright. So Liz, you let me know how we want to go about it. But just to give a very brief one-on-one, this is what's going on. It's a lot of the NFT projects or a lot of the digital assets that are being sold and bought in this space right now currently have a lot of copyright issues, and even the Copyright Office and the USPTO, the Patent and Trademark Office, don't know how to handle those issues right now.
I think if you want to just give a one sentence on what is a copyright, what's a trademark, be good.
Yeah, of course. So the trademarks are an indicator of source. So and I'll be very brief and give examples that I think that's easier to understand. So the moment you sell something, you're indicating the source of that specific good or item that you're selling has a mark, and that mark is, for example, the Nike swoosh or the Nike Just Do It. Those are three different trademarks. You could have a logo, you could have a word, you could have an image. And all those three could be trademarks that indicate that wherever you're selling associated with that specific mark is the source of those specific goods. Same with services. So you have trademarks for goods and services, and they are classified depending on what you're offering, whether those are items, physical goods, whether those are virtual goods, whether those are services. They get classified differently. And then the copyrights are works of art, basically, and you get a number of rights when you create a work that's considered art or considered a work of or authorship. It doesn't necessarily have to be art. That's a thing that you put into physical, tangible form that becomes protectable as a copyright. That is not the same as having a registration. That just means that the moment you create it, you have a copyright, but to get the actual legal protection, which is the copyright registration, that's a different step out and a different layer. But those are the two differences. Ones are basically, and the easiest way to understand it is, just works of authorship of art once put into tangible form, and the other one is indicating the source of what anything that's being transacted in commerce.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. So as we are moving toward a future where there are even careers in the metaverse and architects are being hired and paid to build in digital spaces, brand consultants, advertisers, and others are putting in skills to use and building custom assets in digital spaces. Sometimes they're even compensated in digital currencies for that kind of work. Do you think that there's a continued the continued development in this digital economy will affect the adoption and acceptance of digital assets, and even just everybody's general perception of a digital asset as being something of value? Zach, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I definitely do think that the opportunities that you mentioned, careers in the metaverse, whether it's an architect or an event planner or a designer, I think that these are going to be strong catalysts in driving the mass adoption of digital assets, especially as like newer generations and young people start to find success in it. I think we're going to see both virtual versions of real world jobs, like I mentioned, architects, event planners, perhaps even lawyers and politicians. But I also think what we're going to see, or rather, I think there's a lot of potential for full-fledged, bustling digital economies based on NFTs and blockchain technology in video games like Minecraft, for example. I think that it makes a lot of sense, and it's easy to imagine that there will be players who are blacksmiths or farmers or bounty hunters or just individuals who have used their skills in a game to acquire, scarce resources that other players are willing to pay for. So to me, there's almost no doubt that as people find new ways to monetize their time and efforts in VR, that there's going to be a mass migration of people towards these platforms looking for the same opportunities, especially as we see increases in inflation, real world economies start to worsen, and people are able to use digital currencies to purchase more things in the physical world. I think that it's almost inevitable.
Sart or Ellie, any comments on that?
No, I definitely strongly agree. I think that there is something that companies really need to think about is when they create those economies, how does it affect their player base and their community? We've seen some games that had transferable digital assets rebrand and create themselves again with an entirely controlled economy instead of having those transferable assets. How does it affect bots entering your environment? What does it do on an international basis for your liabilities on tax or commerce, that type of stuff? I think it adds a huge level of complexity, but with that all ownership coming in for players, it does give people a larger reason to contribute on a long-term basis and gives you more of an economic sunk cost feeling of being there also.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those comments. So why don't we turn to real world assets with digital counterparts for a moment? So tokenizing real world assets such as real estate, fashion items, and art is one way of blending digital and physical worlds. And recently we've has come with the controversial word digital to describe, which it rubs some people the wrong way, but is the word that's currently being used to demonstrate this blending of assets. So tracking a provenance of art and goods through either chips or documentation tied to an NFT is one way of reducing the chance of consumers purchasing counterfeit or fraudulent goods. Does this technology increase safety for consumers by reducing scams? Is it more hype and marketing than reality? Ellie, what do you think?
I personally think that the tokenization, I'm split. I think sometimes, for the most part, the ones that I have seen, the tokenization of actual real world assets that I've seen the most useful have been on the real estate side. So we saw a company not too long ago that started tokenizing properties that are for rent, and those will be more easily transferred. So I think that it does kind of help the transferability of some of these assets. But then in some other instances, it does kind of create extra layers that are not necessary. So if you were just to purchase a house, the process would be completely different than if you were selling a property as a rental property and through an LLC as opposed to an individual. So, and I'm not gonna go to like the deep, roots of what that would be in of creating more work than actually solving anything. But I do think in certain instances, the tokenization of assets is very helpful to transact. And that just goes back to not just real estate, but also just the counterfeiting question or that you mentioned earlier. The European Union, the Intellectual Property Office, started using their own blockchain that is meant to be launched by 2023 to track some of these counterfeits. So I think there's tokenizing certain assets. It's kind of helpful, and it kind of puts us in a better place to be able to combat some of the arguments of the lack of utility for the tokenization. Because if you see governments using it, then you kind of start trusting it. Okay, like this is something that could be potentially be adopted by multiple governments and not just individuals and not private companies either. But at the same time, I've seen the tokenization of bonds. So, and there's been 2 bonds that have been tokenized. So one in Spain, one in Colombia. And so there's definitely not a lack of utility for a lot of these. It just depends on what layers are you using. And I don't want to get into kind of political on how they're being used, but some of them are creating more issues than they are solving. So I'll say that. But then some of them are definitely just solving a lot of the transferability and being able to be create more of an equal level playing field for everyone to be able to participate in this economy.
I'm very interested in this from the intellectual property perspective and the ability to track things. One of the biggest problems that we have in the physical world is orphan works and loss of where particular rights are held. An open, transparent registry with the parallels there has a huge potential advantage.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's what the European Union is trying to do, and they're trying to track. I think that in the IP side, this is more of an opinion of mine. I think we would agree benefit having the assignments on chain and being able to track those transparently. First of all, most people don't even know where to go to find what kind of assignments have been done for, especially on the trademark side. And it's kind of like a history record that you basically have to kind of really understand the legal side of it to be able to understand, okay, who has rights and who's holding these rights now. So having an easier, less complex system where it's, you know, available to anyone and it's transparent and you could always track where the new holder is rather than having to go into a centralized record. I think that would be very useful on the trademark side and equally on the copyright side. The Copyright Office, I think that not just from the tracking the assignments and the any other rights that are either assigned or licensed, but also on the copyright side, there's really no transparency to see the actual contents of some of these applications at times or responses. The same way that you would track a trademark registration and application, or from the moment someone applies to the point of registration, is not available for the copyright side. So I think that having some consistency using blockchain and tokenizing some of these rights, I think I couldn't agree more with you. I think that would be a very useful way to use this technology.
I'll just chime in and circle back. I do think that tokenizing physical assets, especially real estate, is really exciting. I think real estate is the best example of a use case where it actually is for the benefit of the public and it's not so susceptible to scams. I think that, I mean, everyone on the stage, or maybe the people in the audience who have taken a bar exam or practiced law, you know, we've dealt with hundreds of questions regarding, you know, false deeds and what happens when someone thinks they own, you know, real estate that they don't actually own. I think that we're going to get to a point where, whether it's the federal government or whether it's individual states, are uploading, you know, ownership records of parcels of land to the blockchain so that the public can verifiably track who owns it. If that were the case, nobody's going to end up buying, you know, land from someone who doesn't actually have legal title to it. But I will say that beyond the initial purchaser of something like a luxury good that's authenticated by an NFT, I don't see exactly how downstream purchasers are going to be protected from scams or fraud, especially because anyone can make an NFT, call it anything, you know, associated with a digital file that's not even theirs. So I do think that there is going to be the opportunity for fraud and scams to take place in terms of selling physical assets like luxury goods, watches, bags, pieces of art, etc., that are linked to NFTs, especially when the buyer's not familiar with how to read block explorers and how to check, you know, the transaction history and ownership history of certain digital assets and how to verify whether the digital wallet deployer of the smart contract is actually the digital wallet of the entity, you know, that makes the goods you're trying to buy, right? So I think that real estate is a unique example, but I think that in terms of other kinds of like physical assets, I do worry that, again, beyond the initial purchaser buying it directly from the company and getting their NFT, I do think there's still a lot of risk for fraud there.
Thank you. That's a great segue into starting to talk about the risks associated with digital asset ownership. So we would be remiss to not acknowledge some of the events of late with the FTX scandals and a lot of the fraud and recklessness that has occurred at major centralized cryptocurrency exchanges and funds while we're having this conversation. Criminal and reckless behavior of specific individuals does not reflect on the technology or the potential for good, but it does cast a shadow over conversations like this. So the majority of scandals as of late were largely due to individuals and corporations having unfettered control over assets, which is why it is so important for us to talk about self-custody. Traditionally, all monetary assets that we hold are secured by centralized institutions such as banks, or physical assets are held at home or in safe deposit boxes. There are many ways to hold digital assets, and one way is using a wallet secured by cryptographic keys. When one holds assets in self-custody, if they lose the keys to that wallet, one can lose ability to access those assets, but it's within the individual's control. When a corporation holds assets, they can be taken away from a user or lost at any time outside of a user's control. there are risks and benefits with both sides. So advocates of decentralization often assume that everyday consumers of assets would prefer to hold assets in self-custody. But most people who hold cryptocurrency hold it on centralized exchanges and have done that to their peril recently. So do consumers really want to custody their own assets? And what type of safeguards can be put into place to protect consumers when they do self-custody and when assets are held by a centralized entity? And if anyone wants to touch on legal remedies here, feel free as well. I'm going to leave this one open, so jump in, whoever would like to comment on that.
I'll start to chime in. I don't think that people really want to custody their own assets. I think that people want to do whatever is easiest for them. And oftentimes that's creating an account on an app like Coinbase or Binance, et cetera, and just giving, like Liz mentioned, the keys to the cryptographic keys to your wallet to a third party to manage your assets. Self-custody is confusing. It can be difficult to get started. I think that anyone who's doing it has to do a lot of research on what it actually means to custody their own assets, what it means to own a digital wallet, what happens actually when someone gets the information associated with your wallet, like your seed phrase, or as Liz mentioned, your private keys. I'm a big proponent of self-custodying your assets, and self-custodying your assets in a quote unquote non-custodial wallet, or a wallet where a third party doesn't have custody of your assets, is a big part of Web3 and allowing this sort of quote unquote permissionless access to all these different kinds of services and products. Because when you have a non-custodial wallet, like a MetaMask, for example, you don't have to identify who you are, where you live, et cetera. But when you use a custodial wallet, or you custody your assets with a third party, you do have to identify who you are. There's often KYC, know your customer, or customer due diligence programs or procedures that you have to abide by. So I will just say that, again, if you're interested in really being involved in Web3 and participating in these like permissionless and decentralized metaverses and other kinds of like online services, I do think it's important to do a lot of research on what it means to self-custody your own assets. And I will just say that the number one thing here is, if there's any takeaway for how to custody your own assets, it's never, ever, ever store your seed phrase or your recovery phrase or your cryptographic, your private phrase online. You don't want to write it down in an email. You don't want to store it in your phone. You don't want to put it in an electronic password manager. We've seen situations where individuals have saved their wallet access, their seed phrase, which is how you access the wallet, on their iPhones. And now when somebody hacks into their iCloud account, they have access to their crypto wallet and they stole millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. This happened, I think, last year. So you always want to make sure that if you own or you're opening a non-custodial wallet, you're keeping the seed phrase stored in a physical location. You're writing it down on ink, on paper, or you're engraving it in steel. You're not putting any of your information online because it's just way too susceptible to be stolen.
Can I add something real quick?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I really agree with you as far as being able to kind of like have your own custody of your own assets. My only concern with that is it just doesn't really it's not very feasible right now to kind of educate everyone and mass scale and onboard everyone and being able to understand what self-custody will entail, the security measures. So I think that self-custody, utopian view will be to have everyone kind of self-educate and understand how to do that. But I think that in order for us to get mass scale and being able to kind of onboard everyone else, it's going to take some centralization, unfortunately. So I think that, Apple is entering into the space. So we see a lot of these bigger brands that are probably going to centralize some of it, but people trust these brands already and they're going to be onboarded through those brands. So, and they're not going to be their third-party custodies of their assets. So I think it's going to be controlled again, kind of like we have banks. Unfortunately, I think we're going to head that route if we're going to have some mainstream users of these assets. But because it's just really hard to educate everyone at mass scale, like it's even hard for us to kind of keep up with all the changes from some of these exchanges and some of the security measures we have to constantly update. So I don't know how else we could kind of onboard more people with all the, how difficult it can be.
No, I strongly agree. I think one of the biggest issues is usability, and usability is going to take precedence over security. And to get that trust, I think you're also going to need an option where individuals have a regulated, insured option available. If it's only uninsured, unregulated options, there'll be a large group of the population that is either overly vulnerable and loses confidence or just doesn't participate.
Thank you for those perspectives. And yes, I think it'll take a balance of the traditional approach we've had going on and moving into a space where people are comfortable and educated on being able to custody assets to be able to move forward. Sorry, Zach, can you mute your audio?
Yes, sorry. I was gonna chime in one more thing because you mentioned FTX. I just want to circle it back to that. I think a lot of people are taking the FTX situation, the $10 billion that were embezzled from customer funds, and I think they're using that as sort of a reason not to dabble in cryptocurrency, right? But I think really it's a prime example of why it's so important to self-custody your assets. Yes, I mentioned this before. Yes, it's more difficult. Yes, it's more confusing. No, it's not perfect, but I do think that it's just a function of time. I do think that eventually people will become more educated on this. And I just hope that the people who are listening who maybe haven't thought of this before start to see the FTX fiasco as sort of an impetus to learn more about self-custody rather than just, turning your cheek to blockchain technology in general.
I agree. I think that's great. A great point to put in there. I'd like to do one more question and then one more topic, and then we can open it up to some questions if there are any. So I think the holy grail of decentralization and an open metaverse is a future of interoperability. So being able to hold assets for yourself or freely move them from one platform to another is really kind of a goal that a lot of people are working towards. But how feasible is interoperability in the short term and long term, given the different development and technological requirements of each platform? And what would a world look like where social media profiles or avatar identities are owned by individuals and can be portable and taken from one platform to another? Does anybody have thoughts on that?
This is extremely interesting to me because you have these tensions of trying to be a monopolistic user where you have everyone and you are the central. But from a user rights perspective, the ability to transfer from one network to the other creates so many more opportunities for competition and allows smaller players to get into the space. We have an issue currently with regards to Twitter and competition other places, and it's so difficult to move from platform to platform. And I'm really excited about this. I think it's really the tech players and whether or not those who are at the top of the market choose to embrace those things. I see why they don't, but long term, if a major competitor comes out and has those abilities to easily enter and exit, it's huge for end user rights.
I sort of picture it as having like an evolution of interoperability. And when I think of interoperability, I'm specifically thinking of, I guess, digital assets in video games more than I am for social media profiles. But I was speaking at the Game Developers Conference earlier this year, and there were a lot of developers, video game developers, and lawyers, and just gamers who were really they were just in their mind, it seemed like they thought interoperability was impossible. It wasn't even worth it. It would never happen. Why even talk about it? It's so difficult, right? There's no way that you're going to be able to bring your laser gun from game one into a caveman game two, right? But I really see interoperability as like a sliding scale. I think initially you're going to have companies that have interoperability for the digital assets between their own services, their own games, or maybe their own protocols. And then hopefully we'll start to see them sort of collaborate with maybe, entities that they had considered their competitors in the past, right? Then we'll start to see like small nuclei of interoperability sort of like form. And I think once some of these clusters of interoperable services start to become popular, I think that eventually somebody will try to find a way or build a way for just increase interoperability between those clusters of interoperable services. So I don't see it as a, we're not going to get there 100% perfectly tomorrow, so why even bother? I think that it really is just a matter of time and effort, and starting to think about the possibilities, not just saying it's difficult, so let's not discuss.
I'll agree with that, with what Zach just said. I also think that we need to get to a level of like multiple, like a standardization of what it would entail for interoperability between this world. So kind of like what we have as, international agreements. I think we're gonna have metaverse agreements in which you have assets that are allowed in different worlds, but they are given the same rights. So or I guess reciprocity as to the rights that they get to, or how they get to use these avatars or personas in their, or assets or skins or whatever it is that you're transferring or porting into the different worlds. But I think we need to get to a level of standardization. So I know we have the Metaverse Standards Forum, and they're trying to create this sort of kind of the same thing I'm talking about, like standardization of what it would look like for one set of kind of ground rules of how they could kind of connect each world. And I think that that's the way to do it, because if you have an open lack of forms or lack of standards, then you have, like, again, we go back to the IP issues, and one asset's going to be used a different way in a different world. So I think that if we have some sort of like agreement, like I mentioned, like like the international agreements that we have with different countries, the same way it's going to be necessary for metaverse, and have this, standards that protect the IP creations in one world that are used later in a different world, and vice versa.
Great, thank you. And I just want to expand on that a little bit. So when these identities, if avatars can be sold and items can be sold, then what happens when the identity can be assumed by somebody else, and somebody takes over a personality, or if there's even AI personalities that come in and can take over a persona that was once owned by somebody else, how does that affect the way that we trust and interact online?
I think that's an issue that's happening right now. I think we're seeing the deep fakes, we're seeing them in commercials, we're seeing them in music and videos, and even the replica of voices, of people's voices that are being, the image likeness, including the voice, is being used in ways that is somewhat deceptive. Maybe not just somewhat, it is deceptive, because it's not who the person that they're using, it's not them. So in that regard, it's a problem of security in how do you ensure that someone's avatar is who they say they are. And this goes back to not just the anonymity issue that goes on in the blockchain, but also once we start seeing the AI replicas, how do we deal with both? Because we have now the anonymity, and now we have the kind of like personification of assets that could be deceptive. So and I would love to hear what everyone else thinks, because I don't have an answer for a solution. I see that problem is kind of like issue spotting at this point, because I don't know how we're going to deal with that.
Yeah, this is really interesting, especially when it runs into the right of publicity space, which is an area that is not very well standardized. When it comes to international intellectual property, it's one of those that has the least amount of agreement. Even within the US, you have drastic differences between Washington State, California, New York, and it has both a commercialization aspect and a right of privacy aspect. This is one of those areas where harassment, bullying, those types of things could also really explode in becoming somebody else on a platform before somebody enters and creates that namespace. And our understanding of what is possible or how to regulate it is so far behind. This is a fascinating area. I look forward to seeing what types of community rules come about on platforms to try to self-govern, and then how governments respond when they see harm to individuals.
All right, thank you so much, everybody, for all of these really fascinating opinions. We're going to open up Q&A for a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions out there? No? Okay.
I guess
any final
everyone understands and agrees with everything we said, which is perfect.
Please go ahead and use the hand emoji and raise your hand for questions, and we'll go ahead and amplify your voice. Jasmine, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep, we can.
Awesome, awesome. So I wanted to ask, I'm interested with the FTX debacle, Celsius. It's proven that custody within centralized sources does not work in cryptocurrency. And you guys mentioned it earlier about your preferences with self-custody. But my question to you is, how do we get the masses to understand that it's important to have a hardware wallet, and also to, make sure that the firmware on that hardware wallet is updated more frequently?
That's a great question. I feel like we have so many steps to cross before we get people to understand why having a hardware wallet is so important. People don't even understand why it's important to have money that's not sanctioned by a government. They don't understand why it's important to self-custody, right? So I think that, again, it's just a matter of time and continuing to, host and attend presentations like this where people just engage in these conversations. I don't know if there's going to be some, PSA on TV that explains to people why it's important to have a ledger or a Trezor and to update the firmware on it. But I do think that as digital assets become more popular, more widely used, it's just going to be a matter of, as we welcome people into these digital economies and as we try to onboard people onto this technology, we make it an effort as the people who are already in the space to educate others about, why it is important. I really do think it's more of a community-based effort than it's going to be some official project from like a centralized source.
I'll add to that. And this is more of I wish it wasn't like this, but it's probably going to be like this. And I see the ledger, the hardware wallet, to equivalent of the floppy disk. And I know that doesn't sound really great, but I think that eventually we'll see more centralization because people trust, like it was mentioned earlier, some of the insured exchanges. So it goes back to trust. And I don't know that we have enough people to onboard the masses. So that's when the bigger companies are going to come in and try to kind of make it, the usability is going to overpower the rest of it. And I don't know that we're going to get to a place where it's mass adopted unless that happens. And I wish it wasn't the case. I wish we could just onboard everyone, tell them, just get a hardware wallet, let's keep it, do self-custody, but it's just going to be really difficult. And I say that because I've tried to onboard people, and I've tried to do it, and also it's even more difficult in different languages. Someone asked me like, what is an NFT in Spanish, and it was even difficult to kind of explain like, okay, like this is how you buy it, this is how you keep it. So I think that if it's difficult now, unless we make it easier to even teach it, because not everyone can teach how to do this, how to buy an asset, how to keep it, how to stay secure within the self-custody. So I really it doesn't sound great, but I do think we need some centralization. Not that we need, but we're going to be seeing some centralization that will bring the mass adoption, unfortunately.
So I think it's super interesting that you compare the hardware wallet to a floppy disk, because that might end up being a very apt comparison in the future. But I personally hope and think that we're going to move to a place where the technology will evolve so that we can onboard more people into custodying their assets. And I think a lot of the trust in centralized institutions is built up on kind of the ability of those companies to be bailed out, especially our trust in banks and things like that. And so the idea that we're seeing all of these centralized cryptocurrency exchanges fail right now because there aren't the same safeguards in the crypto industry that there are for banks, and there aren't the same kind of bailouts that can happen when those kind of funds are leveraged. And so I think that the trust in centralized entities, I'm totally with you, Ellie, that I think in the short term, there's going to be a lot of centralization, and we're going to have to find trusted partners for custodying some of these assets to bring more people into the space. But I do hope that we're going to move beyond the floppy disk, and we're going to move beyond a place where we will, that it'll become easier and it'll become more secure and more familiar to custody your own assets in a way that is safe and feels like you're not just going to lose everything or push the wrong button and send things to the wrong place and not be able to recover them. And so I'm kind of hopeful that while we may have some centralization in the short term, that we'll move to a place where we can, move beyond that as well. So are there any other questions from the audience? You can use the emojis to raise hands if there are any others.
Any other questions?
All right, well, maybe we'll just go for some final thoughts from the panelists, and then at the end of your final thoughts, you can also let us know how to get a hold of you and learn more about your work. Sart, do you want to go first?
Yeah, definitely. What really excites me about this space and where we're going is the number of entities that are really interested in trying new things here. The opportunities are incredible, and as we start to look at how we compensate artists, how we become owners of this space ourselves, I think we have an opportunity as users to push back on the environments that we are interacting with, especially as early adopters, to create a culture that has our rights and our contributions respected by the entities that we are participating with our time and our creation and our art. So I really encourage people to get involved in the communities that are part of the new technologies and help create norms that protect your rights as creators. I can be found Sarterus on everywhere from Facebook to TikTok to Twitter. So.
I'll just chime in and say, Liz, thank you for having me here. Everyone in the audience, thank you so much for attending. I have very high conviction that NFTs are going to disrupt so many industries, and that the metaverse is going to create all types of opportunities for brands and creators and individuals to monetize their creativity and their IP. So I'm just tremendously excited about what's happening here. You can find out more about me and what I do at fkks.com. My name is Zach Lewis. If you want to email me, it's ZLUIS. Soon. Thank you again for attending.
Thank you for having me as well. I too am excited about what this is going to be in the next few years. I don't think it's going to take that long. I think NFTs, digital assets, tokenization is all going to come to fruition in the next few years, especially with the AI uses that we're seeing lately. Again, thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone for attending. And for me, if you want to contact me, my email is etorres@Nixon Peabody, and that would be the same website, so nixonpeabody.com. And I would love to hear from anyone.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us and for this exhilarating panel on digital asset ownership. I think we covered a lot of ground today and really covered a lot of the privacy and safety issues that are really at play when we're talking about digital assets and what it looks like now and what it will look like in the future. My name again is Liz Shubov. I can be found on Twitter at Liz Shubov or on LinkedIn. I'm an advisor here at XRSI, and we're so happy that you all are here with us. Right now, we are going to take a lunch break for about 30 minutes. I don't know if any of the panelists want to join me, but we can head out to the lobby outside of the Taj Mahal here. And if anybody has any questions, be happy to chat there. Thank you, and we'll see you after the break.
Thank you so much for organizing this.